Welcome back, everybody. In this module, we're going to be continuing our exploration of how environments can start to shift us. Now, obviously, we focused a lot in the last module on how the environment can shift our opinions and attitudes about things, and we inferenced how once those things are shifted, how they can actually impact our behaviors and reactions to the world around us. But we're going to explore in much greater depth throughout this module how the impact of the environment can really shift a lot of the things we're doing when we describe or explore this concept of what we call conformity. And understand the importance of conformity, I thought we'd start this class off with a little bit of an activity. One that, well, I'm guessing even though we're not in person, you can probably understand how others around you would react to them. What do we need to do in this activity is imagine yourself being an individual sitting in the audience in the situation in the upper right-hand corner. Now, what I'd also like you to do is imagine some things that you should and shouldn't be doing while you're a member of the audience of that picture in the upper right-hand corner. I'm guessing if you wrote down a list of things you should do, or you were able to volunteer some information about what you should do, most of you would probably mention things like sitting there quietly, wearing certain attire, clapping between songs, essentially trying to stay as quiet and controlled as possible while the music's going on, but enjoying the kind of atmosphere as you have these interludes. This, of course, is all around the context of you going to a concert. And one would think then that that's, of course, how you behave at all concerts until you think about another particular venue that also involves you going to listen to music, like the one you see pictured in the lower right-hand corner. There, my guess is that you wouldn't necessarily be silent while the music is playing. You wouldn't be still. You wouldn't refrain from using your phone, and I'm guessing that your attire would be very different from the attire that you would wear at the first situation. In fact, I would suggest that even though in both those situations, the top and the bottom on this slide, even though your goal is the same in both of them, your behavior on the bottom section might actually be more aligned with your behavior if you, say, attended the event in the middle, where you decided to become a part of a big crowd and watch, say, a football game or some other sporting event. This tendency for us to not only understand how it is we're behaving in these different situations, but to feel compelled to do so, to feel awkward if we don't, is exactly what this class will be exploring. In particular, what we're going to be looking at is, again, this idea of something that we call conformity, where we decide to maintain, change, or start some type of behavior as a result of the presence, or maybe even the imagined presence, of others. And when we're conforming, what we're usually bending our behavior to are these things that we in social psychology call norms. These standards, usually behavioral based, even though they can come in different forms, that we're expected to abide by because of the group we're a part of, or because of the kind of society that we're identifying ourselves with. The norms come in a lot of different forms. We'll explore some of them as we get to the end of this lecture, but in essence, if we're just going to use basic terms, what most social psychologists argue when studying this is that we do have things that push us in different directions, and that pushing, and the kind of byproduct of it, is what we call conformity. And what we're often being pushed into are these things called norms. Well, this brings us to a really important question, and that's why? What is it that compels us to conform in numerous social situations around us? This was actually one of the first questions that early social psychologists asked, not just about this topic, but about the power of the situation in general. And if we look at some of our early inklings as to why we conform, a lot of it was theoretical in nature. Early evolutionary psychologists contended that maybe when we're looking at conformity, we're seeing that's something that's a byproduct of something genetically inherent. Their argument was that human beings cannot rely on reflexes alone to survive in our environment. There are some innate responses to the environment that could potentially help us, and we could potentially learn on our own through different encounters. But if we want to optimize our chances of survival, both as an individual and as a species, well, we need to go beyond that. Evolutionary psychologists argue that maybe we have programmed within us these tendencies to follow along with the pack, follow along with others around us. And this helps for a multitude of different reasons. One, if we're, say, with a group and all moving the same way, we might have a better chance of survival in situations where there is an emergency or is a need to react. Obviously, the classic example that people give when talking about moving with a group to survive is not usually human beings. It's usually we talk about fish in a pod, or we could maybe talk about how herding animals move together in a herd. It's not necessarily really apt for humans, but the general idea here still is that if we do move with others, follow what they're doing, we might be safer, and also we might benefit from their individual experiences that they've had, either through some other individual that kind of taught them how to behave in a situation, or through some personal encounter that they had that led to them doing certain things in a specific way. And the general gist of this argument is that we oftentimes walk into situations not knowing what the appropriate behavior is. So to optimize our chances of being successful in those situations, we theoretically could have something pre-programmed in us to immediately look to others, look for some type of indication of what's appropriate, and quickly then scurry to align our behaviors or emotions or whatever to those around us. Of course, this evolutionary idea is more of a theory than something we can necessarily prove. And this led lots of people in the 1920s, 1930s to try to find ways to devise studies that could help us really find concrete evidence for the environment really mattering. And this led us to the research of a very famous social psychologist named Muzafer Sherif. In 1936, had identified this really interesting phenomena that cognitive psychologists had found called the autokinetic effect. The autokinetic effect is this weird thing that occurs when people are put into a room and there's a light source hanging from the ceiling that looks like it could potentially move. Then they're asked, if there's no other sources of light, intermittently, how much that light source moved. And when people are asked, they don't know this, but the light that's hanging from a ceiling or kind of inserted in a wall can't actually move. It's not actually moving. But when there's a suggestion that it moved, people often, through different quirks in the eyes and just the power of suggestion, start to envision it moving. But what Sharif found really interesting, what he utilized in his study, was that people often, when experiencing this autokinetic effect, vary in the amount of movement that they see. Some individuals, when they're stuck in a room with the light hanging from the ceiling and asked how much it moves at random points, will see it darting all over the room, reporting it's moving a foot or 2 feet or something along that lines. Others will just see it making these tiny little incremental movements, say in a path or a back and forth, as we're looking at the light. And once Sharif recognized that many people, once they see these things moving in this specific amount, tend to stick with it, he decided to do something kind of unique. He decided to pair these individuals up with each other and ask them to estimate the amount of movement that occurred on their own. And what he found, many people argued, was really the precursor to conformity. When individuals would be tested alone, they'd give some type of consistent measurement. But if he, say, paired somebody who saw a lot of movement with somebody that didn't see any movement at all, then what he would often find is by the second or third trial, when they were with each other, these individuals who had never seen it moving a certain amount in alignment with each other would suddenly start to align their responses with each other. And those responses that aligned, much to Sharif's surprise, persisted even after these individuals were then tested alone later on. Sharif's argument was that this is really the hallmark of conformity. We find ourselves in these ambiguous situations where there's something like a light floating in the sky, and we're asked how much it moves, not knowing what a good answer is, so we guess, or if we have the chance, we look to the responses of others and gauge an appropriate response from that. His contention was that this is happening all the time, and it eventually led to the introduction of a lot of terms and concepts that kind of built off this need for conformity because of the ambiguity of the situation. A term that you'll see sometimes listed today is something called informational social influence. This notion that we kind of intuitively understand that when we find ourselves in situations, we don't know often what's the best thing to do, so we rely on the behaviors of others, especially ones that we deem worthy of kind of following. And we act in accordance because we have this implicit understanding that by doing so, we increase our chances of behaving successfully in those situations. But this effect of Sharif's also brings up a really interesting topic. In his research and lots of other theories, there's this implication that conformity is merely a byproduct of us not knowing what the correct answer is in different situations. One of the things that started to get asked in the 1950s was, well, what happens if there isn't ambiguity? What happens if there is a very clear-cut answer? Do people still conform when they see others around them not doing the right thing? This was the main question asked by a very famous social psychologist named Solomon Asch, who in the early 1950s developed something that we nowadays call his line study. In this line study, he'd bring participants into a room with several other people posing as participants and ask them to do something fairly simple: judge the lengths of lines. People would see something flashed up in front of them, much like you see on this slide, where there was a test number, test line, the one on the left, and then 3 different numbered lines on the right. I need to ask them, which line is this one most similar to? 1, 2, or 3? I'm guessing all of you sitting there alone, or maybe with just somebody else listening in, could answer this question successfully. Nobody here would really have to spend a lot of time recognizing that line 2 is obviously much more like the test line than the other 2. And this was what Asch anticipated everybody would be able to do on their own. But again, these people weren't on their own. Asch not only ensured that these people were doing this task with others around them, but they were always either the very last person in a line of people doing this, or the second to last person in this line. So when he'd ask the group what it was they saw, which line the test line was most like, the participants wouldn't get to answer until they'd heard a number of other individuals providing their responses. And unbeknownst to them, as I alluded to earlier, these people were really just posing as participants. They were actually Confederates, aides within Asch's study, that were instructed to get the first couple questions right, but eventually, after they'd gotten the first couple right, to unanimously get a few of the later questions wrong. So if this was, say, the 5th or 6th trial, Asch's participants might say, well, actually line 3 is the one that's most common to the test line. And then another person would say, it's line 3. And they'd go all the way down until the true participant got to go, the person who wasn't being instructed to give a wrong answer. And Asch wanted to know what this would do to us, how we would react in the situation where there really is an obviously right answer, but nobody is providing it. What Ash found is that even in this situation where ambiguity is thrown out the window, most of us do tend to conform, at least occasionally. In multiple iterations of his study, he found roughly 3/4 of his participants went with the group when they gave a series of wrong answers at least once. At least once they buckled to the pressure of the group and gave an obviously wrong answer simply because they didn't want to stick out, or maybe they thought their interpretation was slightly off. He also found that overall, when the group gave a wrong answer, participants, the true participants, would go with the group about 1/3 of the time. This suggested is that some people probably did go with the group every time they gave a wrong answer, but most people recognized the correct answer on occasion and became independent from the group. But we all felt that weight on our shoulders of going with the group, and most people did bend at least a few times to fit in with the group, even in this unambiguous situation. And when Ash published this research, it started this onslaught of studies to try to explain how this worked and how we could tweak conformity by altering the situation that Ash had created just a little bit. One of the champions that really wanted to understand this more was Solomon Asch himself. And he went on to argue that when looking at the conformity of his participants, the justification for why they went with the group seemed to fit into two different categories. Many individuals seemed to be bending to the group because they wanted to just fit in. They didn't want to be the person that stuck out. We nowadays call this desire to conform simply because we want to be a part of a group or fit in normative social influence. But we also see that sometimes this normative social influence can lead us to bend to the group for two different reasons. Sometimes we bend to the group that we really want to be a part of simply because we don't want them to see us as somebody that's not conforming. If we don't necessarily agree with the group but still bend to them, we tend to call this, in today's social psychology, public compliance. If, however, we bend to a group because we feel not only that we don't want to stick out, but the group must be doing something right, even if we don't understand why it's right, we call this private acceptance. And in Ash's work and his follow-up surveys of individuals after they participated, he concluded that a large number of individuals were either conforming because of private acceptance or public compliance. And most people's explanations could really be whittled down to just these two things. Now, it's also important to note that others that looked at this a little bit more extensively tried to understand how this worked and say how we behave with our peers and how we behave with our classmates or how we kind of interact with family members, that these two things aren't always the dichotomy that Ash found in his study. Instead, we might say start with bending to a group just because we don't want to stick out, but over time, after we've done these things over and over again, we might start to bend to the group because we eventually learn or believe that the group's doing things in our best interest or doing things for a very justifiable reason. This has been tied to people's behavior in classrooms that maybe they don't find desirable to begin with, but eventually learn that this is maybe the way we should behave, or at least they conclude that's the way they should behave. It's been found in families, in political organizations, in large groups of people where individuals maybe start just by bending to the group because they're getting into it and they don't want to be that weird person sticking out, and eventually transitions to them doing it because they truly believe that what the group is doing is correct. Whether or not it's actually correct is debatable sometimes, but that's what they come to believe. As Ash's work started to progress, he also introduced a really interesting theory to explain some of the effects that he found. He called it the social impact theory. This theory surmised that there were three critical factors at play when looking at who was going to conform to the group and who wasn't. One of these factors embedded within this social impact theory was the importance of the group to the individual that was sort of under the test. If people were paired up with authority figures or their peers, what Ash often found was that their conformity levels in this situation greatly were enhanced. If they were alone with just a few strangers, well, then their conformity when the group gave wrong responses dropped dramatically. Another factor at play, regardless of whether or not these individuals participating in the study knew those that they were paired up with, was how close those other individuals were. In some iterations of his study, Ash would place participants right next to all the other people providing responses so that when they gave a response that differed from the group, they'd have to experience the stares and questioning looks of all of what they didn't know but were Confederates within Ash's study. In other iterations of the experiment, Ash would place the participants and everybody else in their own separate rooms so they could provide responses without actually seeing the other people that were a part of the study. And Ash consistently found time and time again in these different iterations that how close somebody was to those around them giving the incorrect response did have a huge impact on how likely individuals were to conform. If we're looking at the most robust effect to this social impact theory that Ash discovered, it's probably the last component to this model. It leads us to something that we call the magic number of 3, which alludes to the fact that the more and more people we have in a group, the more likely we are to conform usually. But more importantly, what you need, the magic number 3 implies, is at least a minimum threshold to create this effect that Ash discovered in his line study. If somebody's paired with just one other person, especially somebody they don't know, and that person's giving a wrong response in the line study, very rarely do these individuals go with that other person. In fact, their rates of incorrect responses are about on par with if they were tested alone. If there's 2 individuals that these people are paired with that give incorrect responses, and then it's this true participant's turn, conformity does increase a little bit, but it's not a dramatic increase. It's increased, but it's not until we get to 3 individuals giving an incorrect response that we get to essentially the maximum level of conformity that Ash was able to obtain in his study. If you look at the slide to your right, you might notice that there's some ups and downs as you move from 4 to 6 to 10 and beyond. And you might even think that if we maybe had 20 people in the incorrect majority that we might see a huge drop in conformity. Please consider those differences just sort of noise in the data from Ash's study. What's important to note here is how dramatic the jump up was from just 1 person giving a wrong response to 2 people giving a wrong response to 3. And at that number 3, we essentially see maximum conformity. This was, again, that third component to Ash's social impact theory. It wasn't necessarily the only tweak that led him to a really interesting discovery. It just was the last of the social impact theory. Another tweak that made Ash's research not only very interesting, but very applicable in different situations, was his discovery of the importance of an ally. Somebody that could essentially take the shackles off of somebody feeling like they were beholden to the group and allow them to reconsider the correctness of the group. In his study, he'd sometimes say have 8 Confederates with either all 8 giving the wrong answer or 7 giving a wrong answer and just 1 person providing the correct response before it was the true participant's turn. And in those studies where there was just 1 other person not going with the group, conformity levels dropped from the typical third of the time where people would conform to around 10% of the time where people would bend to the group that was now no longer unanimous. Numerous other studies have shown support for these findings being replicated in a slew of other situations. And if we're looking at the long-term implications of this, What it suggests is that conformity only works well if the group is unanimous, if there is dissent, and the people in the group are doing something that we don't always agree with. The group's ability, its strength, is greatly weakened. It's not that we don't occasionally conform to a group, especially if other factors linked to that social impact theory do start to arise, but it's a diminished effect nonetheless. As we expand our work into other areas where we see conformity, what we tend to find is that not necessarily the specific people around us, but the environment around us can have a pretty large impact on our tendency to conform. When, say, we're faced with a situation where a few others or a large number of others are acting quickly, conformity rates rise dramatically. It's not necessarily something that we could see clearly in the ash line study or even the autokinetic effect study run by Sharif, but subsequent research has strongly suggested that one of the components to getting people to conform is not giving them a lot of time to consider options. And this maybe speaks to that innate tendency, again, of mimicking others around us. Another thing that can matter in terms of needing to react fastly is how fast others are reacting around us. And this actually draws us to a really interesting concept that actually can be found in medicine and other areas of science called contagion. This notion that things within large groups can spread very quickly. Well, just as there's contagions for viruses and other things that we might encounter in other areas, most researchers studying conformity have contended that there's also some elements of contagion in the social sciences, be it the emotions that can quickly spread across groups, the actions that can quickly spread across groups, or even kind of the loss of conscious thought that we sometimes call hysterical contagion. Numerous examples have been cited over the years where people can get swept up in a situation, not even quite understanding why they're doing what they're doing until long after they've behaved this way. The classic example that's often cited is when crowds quickly run from elements or environments simply because others around them are running, even if they don't understand the justification or reason for the behavior. There's also examples of people being overcome by excitement or anger and following along with groups in ways that isn't necessarily based on something that they themselves are experiencing or thinking, but instead just what others around them seem to be expressing. Obviously, we see lots of big examples of this when we look at some of the more tragic cases that we've encountered in our history. But it's important to note that contagions in the social sciences can be milder. They can focus in on just kind of the displeasure displayed by a large number of people in an audience, even if people don't quite know that they're building off of the displeasure of others. Or it can relate to everybody kind of moving to one side of a line because everybody else is doing it without really thinking about why they're doing those specific behaviors. The big point here, though, is that we can see conformity in action and lots of components to it, even when we go beyond the lab and focus on conformity in specific examples or specific situations that are kind of contrived by the researchers themselves. And this push to expand our lens on conformity beyond just the lab and into societies and large groups also issued in research later on that focused on a topic that we've revisited several times in this class. Cultural differences that might exist when we look at who will conform and what they conform to. One of the early comparison studies that was done looked at how people from interdependent, or sometimes we call it collectivist societies, behave differently in comparison to their commonly studied independent society or Western society peers. What numerous studies have shown is that interdependent societies, much as the name sort of implies, tend to conform a little bit more as an aggregate in comparison to people from independent societies. But that is a very simplified explanation for why this happens. If we probe closer at the numbers, what multiple cultural researchers have shown is that people from interdependent societies do conform more on average than independent individuals, but it's more a byproduct of the increased conformity for what we call in-group members or respected peers, and less about what we see when we look at out-group members. In fact, some research has suggested that individuals in independent societies or westernized societies actually do conform more to strangers than people from independent groups, interdependent groups. And that's a really interesting finding, because it suggests that when we learn to conform, it's not sort of a carte blanche thing where we're always conforming to everybody at the same rate. Something that really helps highlight how much learning might play a role is another component to cultural research that we've started to explore, and that's how subgroups within cultures might conform more or less based on some of the things that they learned within those groups. One of the more commonly studied subgroups within cultural research is men and women and their rates of conformity. And what we see is that even though as an aggregate women conform just a little bit more than men, there are certain cultures around the world where conformity rates are much more higher for women than they are for men, and other cultures where the levels of conformity are almost identical. And this, in conjunction with the cultural research that compares interdependent and independent societies, highlights a really interesting point that we might miss if we don't really reflect on it. We've so far talked about how conformity might be this innate thing, how we might just be drawn to bend to the group because it helps our chances of survival and there's no way to resist it. But when we see differences from groups to group, from culture to culture, or even subgroups within them, it really highlights how there has to be some learning component to the development of conformity tendencies. And it brings into question how important early childhood education, early environments, cues within the society might be in the development of our conformity tendencies that we usually start to display even in early childhood and beyond. What makes this story even more interesting is that some of our changes in the media and the way we present information has created a shift even within our society and culture over recent years, where many successive generations seem to be less and less inclined to bend to something like the Ash line study or the autokinetic effect study than generations just previously. And the question is there an end to this? Or is this something that really highlights how conformity, no matter how innate it looks, might be really just a byproduct of the social world that we're creating? Obviously, we've covered a lot of ground here when we talk about this idea of conformity across societies and across a whole bunch of different elements of the environment. And it might lead you to come to a conclusion that I don't necessarily want you to come to. And that's that conformity is something we learn, and essentially we're either conformist or we're not. It's not entirely true. What some researchers have found through different derivations of previous studies we've talked about is that there are situational factors, even within a group, that play a very big role in our likelihood of conforming. When we looked at Ash's original study, what many people were surprised by was the fact that people did seem to conform even in unambiguous situations. But it's important to highlight how when people in the groups were giving wrong answers that were only partially wrong, conformity levels were much higher than when the group was giving really incorrect responses. In fact, new iterations of the Ash line study have consistently shown that when the group is just slightly off in their estimates of which line is most like the test line, conformity rates shoot through the roof in comparison when they're consistently giving completely incorrect responses. Another thing that's been added to this equation was actually introduced back in the 1990s by a trio of researchers named Barron, Vandello, and Brunsman when they invited participants to come in and participate in an eyewitness identification task that was very similar to the Ash Line study, where there were lots of Confederates involved, oftentimes giving incorrect responses, but they added a wrinkle to their version of the study. In their version of the study, they had some participants performing a task that was relatively easy, where the ability to identify individuals was not that challenging in a task. And another one, there was a lot more ambiguity, a lot more confusion. It involved kind of limiting the amount of time that people had and overlapping certain characteristics from individual to individual. A classic example of how an eyewitness or activity could be confusing is actually depicted in the pictures from that original study by Barron, Vandello, and Brunsman, where people would see that individual pictured on the top for a fraction of a second, and then be asked which one of the four on the bottom was the same person as the one that they saw. Easy enough if you get a couple seconds and get to focus on things, but relatively challenging if you just look at it for a fraction of a second. Now, to add to this, what they also did was sometimes incentivize individuals or just ask individuals to perform their best without giving any justification for what would happen if they got answers correct. When individuals were offered pay for getting right answers, and the situation was unambiguous, conformity was almost non-existent. We saw people going with the group about 10 to 15% of the time, essentially the same rate they would get wrong if they were all alone. But in the more ambiguous situations, people, when they didn't know what to do and had group members giving responses that could potentially be right and they didn't know, would often bend to the group more than if there wasn't any incentive involved. In fact, the highest level of group conformity was in the situations where people were enticed with pay to kind of get the right answer, and they were with a group that was giving a wrong answer that was very tough to kind of figure out. All of this highlights that the situation itself is just as important as the overlying environment or the background of the people that are participating in studies or situations where conformity might be at play. And this brings me to one final point that I really want to talk about before we close up with this discussion on conformity. So far, we've talked a lot about the ways that the group can get us bending to kind of inappropriate or incorrect responses. Some research on conformity has tried to explore how to get people to do things really for the better of society. And this brings us to something I alluded to at the very beginning of the lecture. The fact that these things that we conform to, called norms, come in a variety of different forms. More often than not, when we talk about conformity in the social sciences, we're talking about conformity to something we call descriptive norms. Us bending to what we think others are actually doing. There are, however, other types of norms that we can try to get people to bend to. You'll see these sometimes listed as prescriptive or injunctive norms. Well, actually, technically, there's a lot of other types of norms out there, but it's one of the ones that researchers have focused on. These prescriptive or injunctive norms are norms about what people are expected to do, what would be the appropriate behavior in different situations. A classic example of this would be something like a speed limit. But just like speed limits, we can sometimes see that oftentimes injunctive norms and descriptive norms aren't perfectly aligned. Even if we know what we're told we should do on the highway, many of us tend to drive based on our expectations of what others are doing. If we think everybody's driving faster than the speed limit, well, then we'll probably have a tendency to do so. If we think everybody's driving slower than the speed limit, then we'll have a tendency to do that. Oddly enough, we can find two people in the exact same situation with the same prescriptive norms introduced to them, but because their take on what others are doing is different, they can behave differently due to the same prescriptive norms kind of conflicting with the descriptive norms that they understand. So how do we get people to lean on the prescriptive norms when it's better for the society? Well, this was something that's been explored in a number of studies, but one of my favorites was one done back in 2007 by a researcher named Schultz and several others, where they tried to convince individuals within a society to use energy less. Well, actually, it was a small community, not necessarily a society. So what they did in this study was first tabulate the average energy use that everybody in this community was using. After figuring out what the average use was and what was optimal for the power grids that were in that area, they sent out letters to everybody describing how much they were using and how much the average household in their community with a house that was similar to theirs was using as well. Their hopes were that they could find a way to get people to bend just by getting them to align their behaviors with what the group was doing. And what they found was that for people who were using a lot of electricity, they tended to drop their electricity use more when they recognized that they were using much more than the average consumer. But what they also found was that these descriptive norms were so powerful in this situation that it also produced an interesting effect called the boomerang effect, where those using less, what they were hoping to get everybody to do, actually when seeing the results that others were using more, started using more electricity as a result of that information that had been displayed. So Schultz and others went back to the drawing board to see if they could get people to consume less by not just providing the descriptive norms to individuals, but also providing some type of prescriptive or injunctive norm to the group as well. So in addition, in the next mailer, in the next community they were at, to sending out what the average use was from each household and what people were doing in contrast to their peers, they also sent out a description of whether or not people were using more than they would like them to use. If people were using less, they often got some type of congratulatory note with a big smiley face on it. And if they were using more, not only were they told they were using more than everybody else, but they were kind of given a not necessarily mean, but a harshly worded statement saying that they really needed to consume less, and I believe a frowning face was also included on this letter. And what they were able to show through this second iteration of the study was that by having these descriptive norms paired with prescriptive norms or injunctive norms, they could get not only a large number of people to kind of conform and use less if they were using more, but they could also help circumvent that boomerang effect that was there. This means if we want to use this example for something like, say, speeding, what many police officers should probably do if they want get people to speed less is not only provide people with some type of information about how the average person is traveling on the highway, in addition to having a speed limit, but also reinforcing those that are going a speed that's appropriate while punishing those that are going at a speed that's inappropriate. It's tough to do that when you have so many cars on the road and so many other things going on, but if we want to apply social psychology for good when it comes to conformity, that's the type of stuff many social psychologists argue we should pursue. And this brings us to one final thing that's actually going to be a part of our next lecture, well, sort of lecture, the second half of this module. It's this question of if there are these strong norms that can push us, can they not only push us to do good, but sometimes push us to do bad? And what happens if we're not just looking at peers involved, but authority figures, asking people to do something specific? Essentially, what happens when we transition from conformity to obedience, trying to get somebody to act in the way we want? Well, this was the exact question asked by a very famous researcher in social psychology named Stanley Milgram. when he designed his extremely controversial study that we nowadays call obedience. Instead of having me explain it throughout this lecture and have you read about it again, I thought we'd do something unique in this second half of this module. I've assigned the video to the obedience film that Milgram created to show individuals what participants in his study did and also discuss some of the implications from his experiment. I also want to remind you that the book does talk about this a lot. So the expectation is for you to get this second half of the module down. You're to watch the full, almost hour-long video that Milgram created and read the book on this topic. And after you're done, my hope is that you'll have a better understanding of how we not only can get people to bend to groups, but by creating the right situation, having authority figures and specific requests involved, society, groups can get people to bend in ways that we couldn't even fathom just a few decades ago. If any of you are upset by some of the stuff you see in the video or need to talk, I am there, but I think this is a really important thing that I want you exposed to if you've never encountered this experiment. So go into it just with an open mind and be prepared for some things that might surprise you. And for now, though, I'm going to say goodbye. Hope you're all doing well, and hopefully I'll see you all very soon. Take care.